Thank you for that introduction. You know, I was listening to On's story, and in a lot of ways, it's both the same and it's different. And I often start my family of origin story when my parents met. Both of my parents are immigrants. My mother is from England, and my father's from the Philippines. But for the purposes of this topic, I'm going to start further back. He was born in 1933, and so he is actually a generation before On's parents. And he was very restless young man. I knew he ran away to joined the Navy and ran away to be in the Navy. And I was trying to figure out how old he was. He must have been in his early 20s, maybe 21. And while he was in the Navy, he actually didn't marry once, but twice. And so the pictures that you see here, I actually have from my half sister who I met after he died. And So my family grew when he passed away. And so he's about 23 or 4 here. And you can see in the bottom picture how much he's embraced being American. He really loved everything that was that sort of symbolized America. And I think that's really his own inner restlessness, and also he chose a path that many Filipino men chose in coming to the United States by joining the military. By the time he left the military, he'd had a child. They had been divorced. He landed in New York City and met my mother. And funnily enough, one of the reasons they married, as my mother said, and she is a resident alien as well, so she had a green card, and he had been out of the Navy, which meant he couldn't stay in the country, and so he asked, could he marry her so that he could stay in the country? Those were the good old days. So they got married, and he was able to get his green card. And they moved around a lot. They tried to go back to the Philippines, and my dad didn't really like being in the Philippines, I think. He had a hard time getting a job. My mother actually loved the Philippines, learned Tagalog, and then they tried to stay. They visited England and thought to be there. Went back to the Philippines, and then they took a Dutch freighter, and as they tell it, their money ran out in Hawaii. So at that point, I was born. So I was born in Hawaii, and really we stayed there until we moved here in 1974. So I really deeply remember that, because when we moved to San Jose, it was much more monolithically ethnically than it was later in 1974, when there was an influx of Vietnamese immigration. And it was really notable because I felt like I was the only, our family was the only sort of Asian family in the neighborhood. Very much in the same way so I want to back up then to my father being in the Navy. I didn't realize that he'd had such a long tenure in the Navy. When he was very ill towards the end of his life, my sister actually found some photos of him when he was in the Navy, and I tried to see if I could find some. He's very sort of swaggery, and he had a lot of friends. And I don't think he liked those years, because when you joined the military as a Filipino, you became a cook. And I think it was sort of the lowest rung of stature that you could be in the military. And my father saw himself in a much more elevated way. And so when my sister made a book of those pictures that she found in the Navy, he was furious. And so each one of us got a book, but we quickly put it away. He was not happy. When we moved to San Jose, they were able to, we moved from Hawaii to San Jose because they could not buy a house in Hawaii. It was just way too difficult to buy a house. And so when they came to San Jose, they were able to buy a house, and we were actually raised. So I was raised in I and my sisters were raised in San Jose schools. And like An's story, all the first three of us were born in Hawaii. So we had a very multicultural kind of grounding for our lives. And the youngest one you see there in the middle picture, that was taken around 1980. My youngest sister, Rebecca, was actually the only one born in California. And so I'm standing in the background. And then Camilla, who's now a director, is standing in front of my mother. And then my sister, Olivia, is works for the Santa Clara County Jail. And my sister, Rebecca, is now a nurse practitioner. So we all did very, very well. And when my father was sort of in the chronic stages of his illness, which we think actually he contracted from being in the Navy, from exposure to chemicals. He said he couldn't believe how successful his family had become. He was just so proud. And he was so proud because they owned several properties. And he just didn't think that, he said, it's all Mom's fault. She's such a good organizer. It was very sweet. And very much in the way, I actually did some delving into the history of Filipino diaspora. And another thing very similar to An's story is that my father sponsored his sister and family to come to the United States. And so they moved to be with us in Honolulu. And then when we moved to California, they also moved to California. So the bottom picture is, there's only one sister. Well, my oldest sister is definitely missing, but there's only one sister who's not there. But you see my aunt's, basically her grandchildren and her kids, and us sort of melded in together. So there's like 3 generations there. It's really sweet. And I think about the way my father, my parents eventually moved back to Hawaii when I moved. So I was in Hawaii for college and for almost 10 years. And then I moved back to California. They decided they were going to move back to Hawaii because I think my father didn't really feel that comfortable in California. And he just flourished. He was like a different person. He knew everybody. He would walk around. And he knew everybody in the neighborhood. He would literally walk around. He would do so much walking, and he'd walk to Ala Moana Shopping Center. He knew everybody. People knew him. And I think about the time that he came to the United States. If you take a look at the graph, I know it's very small, but the graph itself shows the history of Filipino diaspora and immigration to the United States. And when you think about my family's history in relation to the history of Filipinos in the United States, you actually, very surprisingly, the first wave of immigration came before the United States was the United States as a part of New Spain. And so in the early 1500s, Filipinos were already going south to Mexico, Veracruz, on ships, and also east across to New Orleans. And so there is a huge Filipino population in New Orleans. And then you see, and in the 19th century, they were actually fighting in the Civil War on both sides and in the Battle of New Orleans. And so Americans and Filipinos are very much intertwined. Their histories are intertwined. In the 1900s, after the Spanish-American War in 1899, Filipinos became U.S. nationals. And that's where you start to see Filipinos making their way across the world, really, as part of the military. And and because of war, because of world, and so you see a lot of mass migration for school, in the military, and also as agricultural workers. And and we see this very much so in Hawaii. And so I think one of the reasons my father felt so comfortable in Hawaii was a huge Filipino community, even though they were a different ethnic group from. He was Tagalog, and there were many more Visayans and Ilocanos, but he still, he's just, I think, being back in a tropical place with people from his own country. I think it was a good halfway point without having to actually go home. Although he did go home, and my mother said he flourished. He was like a completely different person, just sort of the life of the party. And then in the 1930s, there was actually, during the Great Depression, a lot of race-based violence and hatred towards Filipinos. And it was at that time that Filipinos were reclassified as aliens. And this had a really a negative impact because, of course, they were in large numbers in the American military. And so post-World War II, there was actually something called the Rescission Act of 1946, where Filipino veterans of World War II were not allowed to have benefits as veterans. And you'll see it again. There was an immigration law that basically limited the number of Filipino migrants to the United States to 100 people, but not in the military. The military, they were able to thrive in large numbers. So my father actually entered the military in the 1950s. So it was the tail end of the Korean War. And I actually toured part of the colorful history of my music, the music side of my life. I actually went to Georgia. And my father had said, "Oh yeah, I was there too." And we were actually landed in a place where there was a base. I said, "You were there?" He never talked about Georgia. He said, "Oh yeah, and then and then of course I realized that's where he was stationed. So he was stationed both in Georgia and then in Florida as well. So he was very much part of that military influx in the United States in the Navy. And ironically, he got seasick very easily. In fact, my mother said when they came over on the freight on the ship from the Philippines to Hawaii, he just basically was flat out in bed because he was so seasick, and he couldn't swim either. So it was ironic he joined the Navy. And then in 1965,
So
yes,
just a time check, if you can, maybe one more minute
yes,
okay, great, thank you.
yeah. So all this by way of, the last piece that I'll end with is in 1965, as they call it, Delano grape strike. Filipinos were there, in fact, had inspired Cesar Chavez to around the farm workers strikes. And so when we think about why would it be important to think about Filipinos in the study of AAPI studies, Filipino history is American history. And so we see, and of course, and the notable people, Filipino and Filipinx people who make up some of the most important people in our history, there is no greater contribution. And I would even say Filipinos were here before there was a United States. And so interesting to look at my family. This exercise was the first time I actually put my family's history in the context of world history. And so so I'm grateful. Thank you, Yi, for having us go through this exercise and for having us in the honor of actually sharing it with a group. That's it. Thank you.